The 7th of December, 1941. Pearl Harbor was still waking up when the sky changed. Men were eating breakfast. Ships sat at anchor. Sunday morning routines moved slowly across the harbor. Then the first aircraft came in low over Oahu, and within minutes, calm turned into fire, smoke, and confusion. History remembers Pearl Harbor through familiar images. Battleship Row under attack. Sailors running toward their stations. Oil burning on the water. The USS Arizona erupting in a blast so violent that it seemed to tear the morning itself apart. More than 8 decades later, that ship still rests beneath the harbor, a memorial to the men who never came home. But on the ship beside Arizona, another story was unfolding. Smaller, quieter, almost lost. A sailor on USS Vestal saw men trapped above the flames. He was not a captain. He was not a famous commander. He did not have time to ask whether history would remember him. He had only seconds to decide whether 6 men would be left where they were or whether one line could give them a chance to live. His name was Joseph Leon George. And on the morning America entered World War II, he threw a lifeline to USS Arizona. Before that morning, Joseph George was not the kind of man history usually follows closely. He was a Navy sailor doing hard work aboard a repair ship. USS Vestal was not a battleship. It was not built to dominate an enemy fleet. It existed to keep other ships alive. Repair ships carried tools, equipment, skilled hands, and the kind of practical knowledge that rarely appears in dramatic war stories, but often determines whether a navy can continue fighting. That detail matters, because Joseph George's world was not one of speeches, strategy, or glory. It was one of ropes, decks, fittings, repairs, orders, smoke, sweat, and responsibility. Men like him kept ships functioning. They handled lines, they fought fires. They did what had to be done when machinery failed and danger arrived without warning. On December 7th, USS Vestal was moored alongside USS Arizona. The 2 ships sat close enough that their fates became linked. One was a repair ship. The other was one of the great battleships of the Pacific Fleet. Arizona symbolized power, tradition, and the visible strength of the United States Navy. Vestal represented something less celebrated but equally essential: the men and ships that made survival possible after damage had already been done. That morning, none of the men aboard either vessel knew what was coming. Pearl Harbor in late 1941 was tense but still familiar. War had spread across Europe and Asia, but for many Americans, the possibility of direct attack still felt distant. Sailors understood that the world was dangerous. They trained, they stood watches, they followed routines. But routine can make even danger feel abstract. Then came the aircraft. The first wave struck with shocking speed. Torpedoes cut through the harbor. Bombs fell onto ships that had moments earlier seemed secure. Anti-aircraft guns began firing. Men who had been asleep minutes before found themselves running through smoke toward battle stations. Some never reached them. Across Battleship Row, steel shook under explosions. Ships that had taken years to build were crippled in moments. Crews fought to understand what was happening while it was still happening. Radios crackled. Officers shouted orders. Sailors carried ammunition, manned guns, fought fires, and pulled wounded men from torn metal. Then Arizona was hit. The explosion was catastrophic. A bomb penetrated deep enough to ignite the forward magazines, and the battleship erupted with a force beyond ordinary description. The blast lifted sections of the ship, sent fire into the sky, and killed hundreds of men in an instant. For those nearby, the explosion was not merely heard. It was felt through bodies, decks, and bone. USS Vestal, moored alongside, was caught in the disaster as well. The repair ship, had already been under attack. Now she was beside a battleship, engulfed by flames and destruction. Fires threatened to spread. Smoke reduced visibility. The water around the ships became dangerous. Every decision mattered. A ship too close to a burning battleship could be lost with her. A delay could mean death. An order could save one crew while abandoning another. In the middle of that chaos, Joseph George was doing what sailors do in crisis. He was working. There are moments in war when the scale becomes so large that individual actions seem almost invisible. Pearl Harbor involved aircraft, fleets, national strategy, and the sudden entry of the United States into a global war. But for the men on the decks that morning, history narrowed into immediate tasks. Put out that fire, move that line, help that man, keep the ship afloat, get clear before it is too late. Joseph George was not watching history from a distance. He was standing inside it. From USS Vestal, he saw what many others might have missed. High on the shattered structure of USS Arizona, 6 sailors were trapped. They were in a place above the worst of the flames, but that height had become a prison. Below them, fire and smoke made escape nearly impossible. The water did not offer safety. Burning oil turned the harbor itself into a threat. Jumping meant falling into fire. Staying meant waiting for death. They waved, they called out, they searched for anyone who could see them. George saw them. That is the first important decision in this story. Not the rope, not the rescue, the seeing. In disasters, people can disappear in plain sight. Smoke, noise, fear, and urgency pull attention in every direction. A sailor focused only on saving his own ship might have missed the men on Arizona. A man thinking only of orders might have looked away. But George saw 6 human beings where others might have seen only a burning battleship. At that point, Vestal had her own survival to consider. She needed to get clear. Remaining close to Arizona was dangerous. Fire, explosions, and the risk of further attack made the situation urgent. There were orders to separate from the burning battleship. Lines connecting the ships had to be handled. The logic of survival was clear. Then came the harder question. Could George obey the immediate demand to cut loose and still leave those men trapped? In war, orders matter. Discipline holds crews together under pressure. A ship cannot function if every man acts independently. But real combat also creates moments where judgment becomes unavoidable. The rule book rarely arrives with enough detail to cover every human emergency. Sometimes, a sailor has to decide what the order is meant to preserve. George had a line. The men on Arizona had no way down. He threw it. It was not a cinematic gesture, not polished, not rehearsed. It was practical, fast, and desperate. A rope crossing the space between 2 ships. A narrow path between fire and survival. On any other morning, it might have been ordinary equipment. On December 7th, it became the difference between life and death. The trapped sailors secured the line. One by one, they began moving across, hand over hand, burned, exhausted, and surrounded by smoke. Below them, the battleship burned. Around them, the attack continued. The distance between Arizona and Vestal was not far in the language of maps, but for those men, it must have felt endless. Every movement required strength they barely had. Every second exposed them to danger. If the line failed, they could fall. If fire shifted, they could be overtaken. If Vestal had pulled away too soon, the chance would disappear. But the line held. One man crossed, then another, then another. 6 sailors made it to USS Vestal. A few minutes earlier, they had been trapped above the burning remains of one of America's most devastated battleships. Now, they had a chance, not a guarantee. Some were badly injured. Some would face long recoveries. The wounds of Pearl Harbor did not end when a man reached another deck, but a chance is not a small thing when death is moments away. Joseph George had given them that chance. There is a temptation, when telling stories like this, to make heroism sound grand and inevitable, but the truth is usually smaller and more difficult. George did not stop the attack. He did not save USS Arizona. He did not change the course of the Pacific War by himself. He threw a rope. And that is exactly why the story matters. History is not only changed by massive decisions made in command rooms. Sometimes it is changed by a single action taken by someone close enough to help. A line thrown across smoke, a hand reaching down, a sailor choosing not to look away. For the 6 men on Arizona, that rope was not a symbol. It was survival. For their families, it became something larger, because when one man survives war, more than one life continues. Children may be born, grandchildren may follow, families carry on. Stories are told around tables. Photographs remain on mantles. A single rescue can echo for generations through people the rescuer never meets. That is the unseen weight of Joseph George's decision. Pearl Harbor became one of the defining events of the 20th century. The attack killed thousands of Americans and pushed the United States fully into World War II. In the years that followed, American forces fought across the Pacific, from Coral Sea to Midway, Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima, Okinawa to Tokyo Bay. The war grew larger than any single harbor or ship. But for those 6 sailors, one of the most important moments of the war came before all of that. It came on the morning of the one attack, when they looked across the smoke and saw a sailor on Vestal willing to help. Joseph George did not become famous afterward. That is another part of the story. Some acts of courage are recognized immediately. Medals are awarded. Citations are written. Names enter public memory. Other acts remain known, mostly to those who witnessed them. They survive in personal memory, in scattered interviews, in the insistence of families, in the testimony of survivors who refuse to let the truth vanish. George's action belonged for many years to that second category. He continued his life. He remained, by many accounts, a quiet man about what he had done. Like many members of the World War II generation, he did not always speak easily about war. Some men avoided those memories because they were painful. Others saw their actions as simply part of duty. Some believed the real heroes were the ones who did not come home. That humility can be admirable. It can also allow important stories to fade. For decades, Joseph George's name was not widely known among Americans who remembered Pearl Harbor. Most people knew USS Arizona. They knew the memorial. They knew the date. The 7th of December, 1941. A day that would live in infamy. But they did not know the sailor on Vestal who saw trapped men and threw them a line. The survivors knew. That distinction matters. Public memory can be incomplete, but personal memory is often precise. The men who crossed that rope understood what had happened. They understood what would likely have happened without George. They carried the knowledge that their lives had continued because someone on another ship had refused to abandon them. In later years, efforts grew to secure formal recognition for Joseph George. Survivors and family members pushed for his actions to be honored. The process was not quick. Recognition often moves slowly, especially when decades have passed and records are incomplete. Eyewitnesses age, documents disappear. The urgency of memory competes with the machinery of institutions. But the story would not go away. That is one of the quiet powers of truth. It can be delayed, but sometimes it endures because enough people refuse to let it disappear. The men George saved had lived the consequences of his courage. Their families existed in part because that rope had crossed from Vestal to Arizona. For them, recognition was not about ceremony alone. It was about correcting the record. Joseph George died in 1996. He did not live to see the formal honor that would eventually come. More than 7 decades after Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy posthumously awarded him the Bronze Star with Valor. The ceremony took place aboard the USS Arizona Memorial. That location gave the moment weight that no ordinary hall could have carried. Beneath that memorial rested the remains of the battleship where so many sailors died. Above it, the family of a man once nearly forgotten received recognition for an act that had preserved life amid one of America's greatest losses. 2 of the men George had saved were present when he was honored. That detail gives the story its final shape. The sailor was gone. The battleship was a memorial. The war had long since ended. But the line he threw across the smoke still connected lives across time. Recognition came late. Too late for George to hear the words himself. Too late for many who had lived through that morning. But late recognition is not meaningless. It is a reminder that history is not fixed simply because time has passed. History can be repaired. It can be completed. It can be reframed around the people it once overlooked. That is what Joseph George's story asks us to do. Pearl Harbor is often remembered through destruction. That is understandable. The attack was devastating. USS Arizona remains a national wound and a sacred place of remembrance. The names of the dead deserve silence, respect, and honor. Nothing about this story should reduce the scale of that loss. But within that destruction, there were also acts of preservation. Sailors carried wounded men, crews fought fires, men pulled strangers from burning water. Others stood at guns while bombs were still falling. And one sailor, on a repair ship, threw a line to 6 men who had no other way out. War reveals terrible things. It reveals violence, fear, confusion, and loss on a scale that can overwhelm the imagination. But it can also reveal the simplest forms of human duty. See someone in danger. Do what you can. Accept the risk. Give them a chance. Joseph George's act did not require rank. It did not require fame. It required attention, nerve, and a refusal to let helpless men disappear into the smoke. That is why ordinary people matter in history. The most famous figures of World War II will always have their place. Presidents, admirals, generals, and battlefield commanders shaped the course of the conflict. But history is incomplete if it remembers only those who gave orders and forgets those who acted when no one was watching. Joseph George was not standing at a podium. He was not commanding a fleet. He was not writing strategy. He was on a damaged ship beside a burning battleship, looking at men who would die unless someone helped them. He helped. For an audience looking back more than 80 years later, the question is not only what happened at Pearl Harbor, it is what we choose to remember about it. Do we remember only the explosion? Or do we also remember the rope? Do we remember only the battleship? Or do we also remember the repair ship beside her? Do we remember only the dead? Or do we also remember the living, and the man who gave some of them a chance to remain among the living? History is made of both loss and rescue, both tragedy and courage, both what was taken and what was saved. On the 7th of December, 1941, USS Arizona became one of the most solemn names in American history. Joseph George did not change that tragedy. No one could. But in the shadow of that burning ship, he changed the fate of 6 men. That is enough. Sometimes we ask too much of historical memory. We expect every story to alter the course of nations. We look for the moment that changed the war, the decision that changed the battle, the hero who changed the world. But not every important act changes the world in a visible way. Some change a family. Some change a future. Some preserve a life that would otherwise have ended. A lifeline does not have to save everyone to matter. It only has to reach someone. Joseph George's line reached 6 men on USS Arizona. That is why his story belongs here. Not because it makes Pearl Harbor less tragic, it does not. Not because it turns war into something glorious, it should not. But because it reminds us that even in the worst moments, human beings can still choose courage. They can still choose mercy. They can still choose to act when doing nothing would be easier, safer, and easier to explain. There is a reason stories like this continue to resonate with older Americans, veterans, families of service members, and people who grew up hearing about the Second World War from parents and grandparents. They understand that history is not abstract. It lived in people they knew. It lived in men who came home and rarely spoke. It lived in folded flags, old photographs, Navy uniforms kept in closets, and names spoken carefully at reunions. Joseph George's story belongs to that world, the world of men who did their duty, came home, and did not always insist that anyone remember. But remembrance should not depend on self-promotion. It should depend on truth. And the truth is simple. 6 men were trapped on USS Arizona. Joseph George saw them. He threw a line. They crossed. Some lived because he did. That is the heart of the story. Everything else came later. The petitions, the ceremony, the medal, the correction of the record. Those things matter, but they are not the source of his courage. They are echoes of it. The courage happened in the smoke, in the heat, in the seconds when a sailor had to decide whether to act. The Bronze Star, with valor, recognized Joseph George long after the moment had passed. But the men he saved had recognized him from the beginning. Their lives were the first citation. Their families were the living proof. Their memories kept his name from disappearing entirely. Today, visitors to Pearl Harbor stand above USS Arizona and look down into the water where the battleship still rests. Oil still rises slowly from the wreck, often called the Tears of the Arizona. The memorial is quiet, white, open to the sky. It invites silence more than speech. But somewhere in that silence, Joseph George's story should also be present. Because remembrance is not only about mourning those who were lost, it is also about honoring those who tried to save who they could. The sailor on USS Vestal did not save a battleship. He saved men. And sometimes that is the most human victory history can offer. History deserves to be remembered. If stories like Joseph George's still matter to you, consider subscribing to History Reframed. Every story we preserve helps keep alive the memory of ordinary people who stepped forward when history asked something difficult of them. Until next time, remember this: history is rarely changed, only by famous names and grand decisions. More often, it is shaped by ordinary people who notice someone in need and choose to act. And sometimes, a single line thrown through smoke is enough to carry a man back into the future.